You requested it, and we listened. Today, we are going to rank every single game on the Virtual Boy from worst to best. April Fools! Nobody requested this, and we could have just gone the rest of our lives without anyone asking for it. Joke's on you. Or us, I suppose, since we now have to actually play this nonsense.
Marketed as a portable system, the Virtual Boy was far from convenient to play. Essentially, it was a couple of screens on stilts, and you'd press your face against it like you were watching some kind of peep show. Its main selling point was its 3D effect, which did indeed work, but was nowhere near impressive enough to sell the public on its novelty. Not helping matters was its tendency to make players sick. In fact, every Virtual Boy game comes with an automatic pause option, which will stop the game every 15 minutes or so to allow the player's eyes and brain to take a break. That's when you know you've designed a great product.
If the thought of a console that could make you vomit in only a quarter of an hour wasn't horrifying enough, journalists cautioned users against playing it due to concerns about everything from seizures to permanent brain damage. Not really worth the risk so that you can play Mario's tennis, is it? The Virtual Boy died a quick and unmourned death, but how were its games? Did they deserve better than to be buried with the console? We'll look at each of them and find out.
But before we get to the rankings, a few ground rules. Actually, there really aren't that many. The Virtual Boy library is small enough that there's no need to exclude anything. We will only be covering official games, so no homebrew titles, but that's about it for rules. Outside of that, we'll simply be ranking every single Virtual Boy game on a scale of extraordinarily crap to still very much crap, but not as much so. Make sense?
Let's rank 'em. I'm Ben.
And I'm Peter from TripleJump, and here is every Virtual Boy game ranked from worst to best.
Number 25, Virtual Lab. In some cases, as you'll see, Virtual Boy games have been unfairly tarnished by the legendary rubbishness of the system itself. Developers did their best, and in at least a few instances actually managed to produce games worth playing. Then, there's Virtual Lab, which single-handedly justifies every ounce of vitriol to ever have been spat at the console. The game consists of dropping bits of intestine into the playing field, which disappear if you manage to cap off both ends. We aren't joking. The game is disgusting. What's more, the controls are sometimes unresponsive and other times too sensitive, with no consistent middle ground. Number 24, SD Gundam Dimension War. It's almost impressive how sluggish and frustrating SD Gundam Dimension War is. It feels at times as though it's been designed as a perfect parody of bad video games, and for that reason alone, it's probably worthy of being called the definitive Virtual Boy title. Nothing about SD Gundam Dimension War is fun, even though it's a game about robots blowing each other up while hurtling through space. How is that possible? Perhaps it's the endless rush of stars that fly toward the camera and are almost impossible to distinguish from projectiles. Perhaps it's the snail's pace at which your robot moves, making it feel more like you're playing as a bin lorry. Or perhaps it's the fact that you and enemies can move into the foreground or background at will, forcing you to chase them back and forth in the hopes that you might accidentally deal damage before they switch planes again. Let's not play SD Gundam Dimension War long enough to decide. Number 23, WATERWORLD. WATERWORLD is the only movie tie-in on the Virtual Boy, and in keeping with proud TripleJump tradition, nobody involved with the making of this video has seen the film. Somehow we don't think that's a problem, as the game is a simple score attack with no real narrative. You guide a small boat around an almost completely empty map with a number of swimmers in the middle. It's up to you to shoot the approaching bad guys before they make off with anyone. Kidnapped swimmers don't respawn between stages, and the concept isn't light years away from arcade games such as Defender or Donkey Kong 3. Its quality is light years away though, don't get us wrong, but it's, mechanically similar. Ultimately the game lacks variety, the controls are too floaty, and there seems to be hit detection issues, but we can say that its reputation as one of the worst games ever has been exaggerated. You can trust us on that, it's our specialty subject. Number 22, Red Alarm. If you've ever wondered what Star Fox would be like if it were terrible, look no further than Star Fox Zero for the Wii U. If you've ever wondered what Star Fox would be like if it were terrible and also extremely hazardous to your eyes, why not check out Red Alarm? We will tip our hats a bit to developer T&E Soft for at least trying to present the game as a VR experience, something a surprisingly few number of titles even attempted. Then again, Red Alarm is dreadful, so perhaps that's a good thing. 3D vector graphics could have worked well enough if, there were any way of distinguishing between surfaces and the space between them. As designed, Red Alarm overwhelms the player with lines stretching out in every direction. It's the gaming equivalent of walking through a spider's web, but far less fun. Number 21. Virtual Fishing. Virtual Fishing is a fishing game on the Virtual Boy, so the title checks out at least. What it's not, however, is enjoyable in any way, shape or form. To start with the good, the game looks fine. It has something of a confused art design. The fishes look realistic while the humans look cartoony, but this far down the list we'll take what we can get. And that's about all we can say in the game's favour. Virtual Fishing ranks among the simplest of dedicated fishing games, with little more for the player to do than choose a location, cast a line, and reel in some sprites. This is by no means an inherently bad thing, of course, but it does mean Virtual Fishing has nothing unique to offer. Any other fishing game will give you at least as rewarding an experience, and those games won't require you to stick your face into the blindness accelerator that is the Virtual Boy. Number 20. Mario Clash. What is a Nintendo console without Mario? Well, the Virtual Boy, almost. The nearest thing we got to a proper Mario game was this reimagining of / spiritual successor to the 1983 Mario Bros. Arcade game. In fact, it was originally envisioned as a direct remake of that game until someone on the development team worried that people might actually enjoy it, at which point it was redesigned immediately. Mario Clash really isn't bad as a time killer. It's the sort of thing we can imagine working well on mobile phones or as a downloadable 3DS title for quick bursts of forgettable play. But as a retail release, it lacks pretty much everything. It's a very basic score attack game that doesn't save your high scores, and it features 99 levels without the ability to pick up where you left off. Interesting design choices, Nintendo. It would have been cheaper to just post everyone who bought a Virtual Boy a letter that says, "We don't like you." Number 19. 3D Tetris. The 1989 version of Tetris was a system seller for the Game Boy. It was a pack-in, yes, but it was also the reason so many people had to own the system. It immediately sold consumers on the unique features of Nintendo's new handheld. In 1996, 3D Tetris could have done the same thing for the Virtual Boy, if either of those things were good. One of the reasons Tetris took off the way it did was its simplicity. Slot pieces into places to create lines. Easy. 3D Tetris, by contrast, is much more complicated and far more difficult to explain. It's sort of like Tetris, only it's in 3D. The screen keeps shifting and you need to create layers rather than lines. And the blocks are more complex, both in terms of how to fit them into others and how to control them. And different difficulties give you different blocks, and you get the idea. Ultimately though, the problem is that 3D Tetris just isn't any fun. It takes a long time to get used to, and that's time you could spend doing something more productive, like returning 3D Tetris for a full refund.
Number 18. Mario's Tennis. That's Mario's Tennis, not Mario Tennis. When we think about Mario sports games today, we think of things like Super Mario Kart, Mario Superstar Baseball, or even Super Smash Bros. Basically, games that take the visceral thrill of an event and pair it with fun, accessible mechanics the whole family can enjoy, which makes revisiting Mario's Tennis an odd experience. Admittedly, it predated most Mario sports games, but it's very strange to see Nintendo stick its mascot into a sporting event that isn't fun. Mario's Tennis is almost shockingly dull. Move your character and press a button to knock the ball over the net. Repeat until dead. It's serviceable, but it's really not engaging at all. On the bright side, the character sprites look great, and the game actually takes advantage of the Virtual Boy's sense of depth. On the stranger side, Nintendo included 7 characters in the game. Not 6, not 8, but 7, meaning there's always an odd man out, in tournaments. If we didn't know better, we'd suspect their heart wasn't in this one. Number 17, Vertical Force. Perhaps unexpectedly, Vertical Force would have been a much better game if it hadn't tried to do anything interesting. On its surface, it's a simple, vertically scrolling space shooter. You blast away at enemies and try to avoid projectiles. Standard stuff. It works fine and is pretty responsive. It falls apart, however, in what was surely intended to be its most impressive feature. The action unfolds on two planes, the background and the foreground. You can move freely between them to avoid hazards or to engage enemies. The problem is, though, that it's never easily clear, as Father Dougal would no doubt sympathise, whether something is small or far away. The Virtual Boy's simulated depth only helps so much. Without already having the reference point of how big a particular enemy, obstacle or projectile is meant to be, it's extremely difficult to know which plane it's on. This is especially problematic in a fast-paced genre such as this one, and it's a gimmick that actively works against the gameplay experience. Oh dear. Number 16, Galactic Pinball. If there's one thing you absolutely need before you call your game pinball, it's, well, a pinball. Galactic Pinball, for whatever reason, instead features a puck. And we're not just being snarky about the graphics, the game does actually refer to it as a puck. What is a puck doing in a pinball machine? Lord knows, but it would probably rather be anywhere other than in Galactic Pinball. While previews of the game spoke positively about its physics back when the game was called Space Pinball, still pinball, the released and renamed version altered those physics heavily, presumably so nobody would accidentally enjoy playing it. It is impossible to predict how the puck will move, and it seems to have the ability to slow down and speed up of its own volition. It says a lot when a pinball game on the NES was more creative, more fun, and contained far superior physics than this. 15 years after the release of Galactic Pinball, the Nintendo DS became the home to Galactic Tazball. It's not related to this game in any way whatsoever, I just wanted to say Galactic Tazball. Let's move on. Number 15, Virtual League Baseball. Virtual League Baseball is about as bare bones as a game can get. It does indeed allow you to play baseball, but without interesting mechanics, or opportunities to develop any kind of nuance or strategy. Essentially, the game is simplified to the point of it not being worth playing. It doesn't even look especially good, going for an ill-advised realistic approach when cartoony graphics suited the system far better. Throughout the entire game, unrelated surf rock spirals out of control on the soundtrack, but the developers mercifully provided an option to switch it off in favour of golden silence. The pace of the game is also irritatingly slow, making the experience feel far less thrilling than any sport ever should, with the exception of bowls, obviously, where a complete lack of thrills is the whole point. Oh god! Oh no, we stand corrected! Oh, sorry, Virtual League Baseball, you're bottom of the pile. Number 14, Dragon Hopper. Every console has its share of unreleased games, titles that were developed and sometimes even finished, but never made it to shelves. This is certainly true of the Virtual Boy, which had a lifespan of only 5 months in Japan. That's not much time for a developer to build a game from scratch and get it into stores, which means a large number of games intended for the console were simply never finished. Dragon Hopper, though, may well have been complete. It was far enough along to at least warrant an advertisement, though it was an admittedly vague one. Screenshots and demo footage were also released to stir up a bit of hype for the title, and sure enough, previews were optimistic, not least because it was being developed by Intelligent Systems, a talented developer best known today for series such as Fire Emblem and WarioWare. Sadly, we can't say much about Dragon Hopper because the ROM has yet to surface, so why have we ranked it above all the other entries so far? Well, because not playing this game was more fun than playing all those others. Ho 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 ho! Good times had by all. Number 13, Space Invaders Virtual Collection. To be clear, Space Invaders as we know it is a better game than anything that came near the Virtual Boy, including everything remaining in this video. But this specific version was never going to reach the classic status of the arcade original. For starters, this release contains the absolute smallest number of games that could possibly be called a collection. 2. At least 3 other official Space Invaders games had come out by this time, but they just weren't represented here for some reason. Each game does have a 3D mode, slanting the action towards the background, but it honestly doesn't look much better than the original games did 2 decades prior. The 3D mode also makes it look like the aliens are marching towards you rather than descending from space, like in the title. On the bright side, if you have a copy of this game, you can cash it in for a pretty penny. It's one of the rarest Virtual Boy games out there, and proof that fans of the system, wherever they are willing to put up with almost anything. Number 12, Panic Bomber. Bomberman on the Virtual Boy could have worked quite well. The overhead view would have spotlighted the unit's capability for simulated depth, and the simplicity of the sprites and gameplay would have overcome the system's graphical limitations. Instead though, the Virtual Boy received a port of Bomberman Panic Bomber with the Bomberman name removed. It's a falling block puzzler, and a good one to be fair. It features between match banter with quirky enemies similar to Puyo Puyo, and is without question a fully competent and serviceable game. But it in no way took advantage of the Virtual Boy's unique features. In fact, it had already appeared on at least 5 consoles, none of which featured 3D, and all of which featured colours. Frankly, Panic Bomber is the worst version of a good game, which we suppose is all that can be reasonably hoped for with a Virtual Boy title.
Number 11. NESTER'S Funky Bowling. Thanks to Wii Sports, there is an entire generation of gamers who will forever associate Nintendo with bowling games. NESTER'S Funky Bowling did not have quite the same impact on the Virtual Boy generation. Of course, that's mainly because no human being before me has ever used the words virtual and boy and generation in the same sentence. It is, however, a decent bowling game. Also, true to its title, it has a genuinely funky soundtrack. Unfortunately, once you've mastered the timing, which shouldn't take more than a few frames, you've mastered the entire game. There are practice and challenge modes, but all those really do is help to teach you that timing. Nintendo Power counted it as among the best games on the system, which might seem like a biased opinion, as Nestor originated as a character within that magazine's comic strips, but ultimately, they were correct. NESTER'S Funky Bowling is a perfectly competent game on a system where competency is a genuine selling point. Number 10. Niko-Chan Battle. You probably won't recognize the name Niko-Chan Battle, but you might know it as Faceball 2000. The title suggests that this Virtual Boy version of the game would have stayed in Japan, but it actually didn't even get that far. It was cancelled and remained unreleased and unplayable until a ROM leaked in 2013. Not that we think Niko-Chan Battle would have saved the Virtual Boy, of course, but a first-person shooter such as this certainly did far more to show off the console's features than anything that actually made it to stores. The Game Boy version already impressed critics in 1991, so a version with a true 3D feel and actual depth would have been nice. Playing it today, Niko-Chan Battle is not likely to impress, but at the time, it had a real shot at giving the Virtual Boy a reason to exist. Number 9. V-Tetris. Hands up if you think the Virtual Boy needs a second version of Tetris. No? Nobody? Right, well, here's one anyway. V-Tetris was one of the system's Japan-exclusive titles, and it's much more faithful to the Tetris formula than the one that came to the West. 3 game modes are available. 2 of them, an endless mode and a level-based mode, will be familiar to anyone who has ever played Tetris, a group so large we think it might actually include people who died hundreds of years before Tetris was even invented. The 3rd mode is the only one that takes advantage of the Virtual Boy's unique charms, and it's also where things get interesting. In this mode, you can rotate the playing field. Think of it like turning a cylinder by using the L and R buttons. It's not an easy concept to get used to, but it's a legitimately interesting way of making V-Tetris stand out from other versions of the game. Number 8. Space Squash. In addition to having the most delicious sounding title of any Virtual Boy game, Space Squash is also one of the system's best. Faint praise, we know, but it's surprisingly addictive for such a simple game. Calling it Squash probably did the game even fewer favours than releasing it on the Virtual Boy ever did. The game has very little to do with Squash outside of a few wall-based sequences, and instead sees you engaging in a deadly game of explosive tennis with angry robots. We defy you to come up with a worse title for that premise than Space Squash. The game introduces a number of wrinkles throughout to keep you on your toes, but you can earn power-ups to turn things back to your advantage. It's a fun enough game, and it manages to elicit that just one more go feeling better than anything else on the system. Number 7. Innsmouth no Yakata. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. For a console that rendered everything in the colour of viscera, there's a surprising lack of horror in the Virtual Boy library. Innsmouth no Yakata, or House of Innsmouth, although it really doesn't matter because the game never got an English language release, aimed to fill that gap. Is it good? No, it is not good, but it does get a lot of points for effort. The game sees you exploring a haunted mansion in the 1920s, besieged by monsters inspired by the writings of H.P. Lovecraft. That description probably brings to mind Alone in the Dark. Not that one! That one. And sure enough, Innsmouth no Yakata, which released 3 years after Alone in the Dark, does feel like a pale imitation. It's not all bad though. The first-person perspective is a natural fit for the system, and the fact that you need to have your eyes so close to the screen can make the sudden appearance of monsters that much scarier. It's a better concept than a game, but still, what a concept.
Number 6. Virtual Boy Wario Land. Bring up the Virtual Boy library to enough people and you'll eventually hear, well, Wario Land was good at least. Or perhaps, Wario Land deserved better. Or maybe even, why'd you keep asking people about the Virtual Boy library? We hate to break it to you, but Virtual Boy Wario Land isn't actually that good. Don't get us wrong, it's better than nearly anything else on the system, but by the standard of, actual decent games, it comes up well short. It plays like the first Wario Land for the Game Boy, which makes sense because that was the only other Wario Land game released at that point. But the series didn't really develop into something special until the games that followed, leaving this to be little more than a platformer with a sluggish hero. It's also very short. The game, I mean, not the hero. Well, I don't know, maybe both. There are only 14 stages, 4 of which are basically just boss fights. Now, the first Wario game had 40 stages, illustrating how slight an offering this is. Granted, you'll be vomiting into a bucket well before you finish level 5, so the actual length of the game is moot, but we thought it was worth mentioning all the same. Number 5, Bound High. At Famicom Space World 95, Nintendo's then president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, announced Bound High as, quote, the most promising title on the Virtual Boy. As with all of the Virtual Boy's promise, though, this went unmet, as Bound High was never released. This is actually disappointing, as Bound High was indeed a fun game, easily superior to most of the console's library. It's an action puzzler that relies on the system's simulated depth. You control ScHlAuChi, a robot who can compress himself into a sphere, and it's your job to avoid hazards and vanquish enemies as you bounce through tricky stages. Bound High actually began as software for correcting eyesight, so its development into a game that was genuinely fun and anticipated was a pleasant surprise. Mercifully, it's playable now thanks to leaked ROMs, but sadly, it never made it to stores. ScHlAuChi did, however, go on to star in 1997's ScHlAuChi 55 on the Game Boy. That game is nearly as obscure as Bound High, but hey, at least it was actually released. Number 4, Virtual Bowling. Virtual Bowling is, hold on to your hats, another bowling game, and it's one without a fraction of the charm or creativity of NESTER'S Funky Bowling. And yet it is still by far the superior experience. Virtual Bowling was designed by Athena, a company that had already developed bowling games for the NES, SNES, and Game Boy. They developed plenty of other games as well, but by the time they got to Virtual Bowling, it was safe to say that these guys knew how to make a bowl. bowling game. As a result, virtual bowling has more technique and nuance than most bowling titles, which we think is a very good thing, showing off just how polished the game actually is. As you've seen, polish of any kind is a rarity for this system, and Athena deserves credit for putting genuine craftsmanship into what could have been yet another throwaway title. Could have really split the crowd there. Oh, Lord, spare us that. Okay, I'll stop now. Number 3, Tele-Roboxer. The only Virtual Boy game we'd like to see become a series, Tele-Roboxer has a lot of promise. It's a silly boxing game that sees you beating 7 shades of red, it has to be red, out of your opponent as you each control a giant robot. Think Rock'em Sock'em robots with the mechanics of Punch-Out, and you've got it. It also serves as a good introduction to how other games could have better utilised this system. Controlling the action with a D-pad in each hand and your face against a visor goes a long way towards making you feel like you're actually sitting inside your mechanical fighter. It's not an easy game, truly the Dark Souls of Virtual Boy sci-fi robot boxing titles, which means you won't get much out of it if you don't take the time to master it, but it's certainly a great concept that deserved a better chance to shine. Number 2, Golf. Nintendo's consoles have been home to a number of great golf games throughout the years. Golf on the Virtual Boy is not the best of them, that honour goes to Mario Golf World Tour on the 3DS, because I'm sure you were dying to know, but it is honestly quite good. It controls well, and its 18 courses are decently designed. Also, you can play any of them whenever you like. This makes it perfect for the brief play sessions necessary to keep the Virtual Boy from blowing your head apart like that guy in Scanners. Where it falls down is in its Virtual Boy specific features, such as a colour scheme that makes it look like you're golfing in the depths of hell. Not really something that could have been avoided by the developers, but pretty grim all the same. The menus and shot gauges are also arranged as 3-dimensional rings, obviously intended to show off the Virtual Boy's defining feature. All it really does though is make them a little more difficult to use. However, putting all that aside, this is genuinely a pretty solid game.
Number 1, Jak Bros. We don't have time in a list like this to get into just how weird a history Jak Bros has. We will say, however, that it's a spin-off of the Shin Megami Tensei series, the series that ultimately found worldwide acclaim for its Persona games, and is the very first of those titles to be released outside of Japan. That's right, the Western introduction of what would become one of gaming's most beloved highlights was on the Virtual Boy.
Jak Bros doesn't play anything like Shin Megami Tensei or Persona though. It's an action game with a dash of problem solving. You can play as 4 different characters, the titular Jak Bros and an unlockable pixie, all of whom will be recognisable to Shin Megami Tensei and Persona fans today. Your goal is to guide your character through a series of descending levels, solving navigation puzzles and fighting bosses.
And it's actually fun. Jak Bros is a well-designed game with some genuinely great ideas. It very much deserves a remake, especially with the rise of download-exclusive budget games, and we genuinely hope it gets one. That's something you'll never hear anyone say about Red Alarm or Virtual Lab.
So there we have it, that's every Virtual Boy game ranked from worst to best. As in, forever. There will never be another game and we'll never have to speak of this system ever again.
On the bright side, concerns about brain damage have proven to be unfounded. We've now played every game on the system, and aside from constant nosebleeds and the loss of all memory between the ages of 12 and 25, we're perfectly fine.
If you have suggestions for other Every X ranked from worst to best videos, let us know in the comments below. We promise to only make fun of your idea if it's a really stupid one. You can follow TripleJump on Twitter here, and while you're at it, why not support the things you enjoy by having a look at our Patreon.
Finally, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. I'm Ben from TripleJump.
And I'm Peter from TripleJump, and thanks for watching.